各位观众，大家好，我是小田老师。今天我非常荣幸来到南非最著名的画廊之一 Stevenson， 跟这里的副总监Sinazo 有一次非常有意思的对话。我们今天向Sinazo 会好好的求教一下，来自非洲的当代艺术有什么特点？我们来一起看看他最喜欢的哪些来自非洲的当代艺术家。
Ni hao, I'm Sinazo Chiya, and it's wonderful to be with you today.
Sinazo, would you like to share with us how you came into the art world?
Well, I think I come into the art world like a lot of people, from a love of ideas, from a love of art itself. But I was trained, I did my undergraduate degree at Rhodes University in art history and English literature. And then I did a postgraduate qualification in journalism. And following that, I did an honors degree in curatorship. So as a whole, I knew that my path was geared towards writing about art, communicating about art, and curating art. And from that point on, I've just been in this realm, helping bring the world of artists to people.
Would you like to share with us what does a curator do? This might be a job not so familiar with people from the outside world.
Sure. I mean, it's a word that's also used a lot in everyday conversation, I think. Slowly but surely, people say they curate magazines and furniture and stuff. But in the art world specifically, it means, in the most simplest way of putting it, it means putting things together to help their meanings emerge more coherently for other people to understand. So in the context of an exhibition, curating means assembling works, assembling ideas, assembling objects, assembling writings to better help a concept or a theme or even a certain line of thinking be clear to an audience.
Okay, that's very cool. Speaking of African art, or contemporary African art,
Yeah.
we do have a Chinese audience thinking of African art as more of the masks, or the very traditional approaches.
Yeah.
But what you described was something very innovative, very creative, very rule-breaking. How did we get there from very traditional African? What is the journey of African art to the contemporary scene?
Wow, I mean, it's a long story. I mean, of course, art history is in itself a story, but where, things like masks are pre-colonial objects in a way. There were things that were used by various societies, as you said, like whether it's in Benin or West Africa or Egypt, that had religious purposes for the communities that were in those specific regions. There were objects that were made ceremonially, they were made for daily use. But how we got to the contemporary is through, and this is also something of a simplification, but we got there through, the advent of colonialism, the advent of modernism, the advent of people living in a contemporary society that was shifting, that was being industrialized, where, their roots of, living in agrarian or like pasture-focused societies had to change with the entry of the West into their daily life, whether it was, through colonial extraction or whether it's just through like migration routes being established where people went abroad more, whether by choice or not by choice, whether it's through conflict, but it came about through the influences of different cultures coming together in positive and negative ways, but it made, the synthesis of the world that we live in now, the introduction of labor, the introduction of work, the creation of currency, all that kind of the cumulative values that bring us to the society. So after the modern, then came the contemporary, which looks at all these things and even incorporates some of these indigenous ways of thinking. There's some photographers who are contemporary photographers who even take photos using these masks to make contemporary works as a comment on then and now and how all those things combine.
What are some of the features of contemporary art from Africa? And because when we enter a new field, we don't even know how to appreciate.
Sure.
So maybe some starting point for us to learn about this whole beautiful space.
Yeah. I think what's interesting about African contemporary art, especially, there are a lot of theorists who contradict and overlap when it comes to discussing the field. But I think something that's important to know from the beginning is that it's not just the work from this, continent, the subcontinent itself, but it's also about, the diasporas that inform it, artists who have dual existences between Africa and Europe, Africa and America, Africa and the Asias. The story of African art is also a story of movement specifically, especially because of the history of things like slavery, the things of, colonial imposition, the movements that Africans have made. So some of them are even not necessarily born on the continent to qualify as contemporary African artists because their experience and their point of origin is so marked by movement, as is, the history of this continent in particular. But as you say, one of the key features of African contemporary art, at least, how I've come to understand it now, is a very deep and very profound marking of history. It comes from a keen appreciation of how we come to be in the present, whether that's, looking at, colonial inquest and the process of liberation that necessitated, or whether it comes from, I suppose, a more joyous observation of this past by really inspiring people to look at their roots, trace things, and rewrite the histories that were written for them. So I think whether it's people working in things like ceramics, whether it's people working in painting, what's interesting about African contemporary art is that it never loses sight of its lineage as work that is from a land that is marked by so many stories. Even one of the books that are quite significant to, this field, I'll show you the title later, speaks of African contemporary art as always being made by bricolage, it's almost like collage. It's like a combination of all these factors. Is a big constituting part of contemporary art. It's just never one thing.
Wow. So the tradition is always in the contemporary. Mm-hmm. And then there's an element of mobility all the time.
Yeah.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
And would you like to share with us some of your favorite contemporary African artists and their artworks?
Yeah. So Edson Chagas, for example, is an artist who, did a sort of training in things like photojournalism before he came to being a fine artist. But he uses things in a series called Tipopas. He uses the traditional African masks, but he also overlays his sitters wearing Western suits, whether it's a suit and tie and kind of jazzy, eccentric looking outfits as a comment on contemporaneity as a state in which, Africans are grappling with modernity and living in this kind of climate while still grappling with, a head that's still tied into traditions, that's still working through an indigenous positioning. And even the conflict that sometimes arises between that, because some of these masks, are held in European collections. Some of them have been looted or plundered or decontextualized and, reframed incorrectly. But in celebrating these by photographing them, he's restoring a sense of knowledge to them, a sense of dignity to them, while also reflecting the contemporary mindset of being both these things, of being comprised of the past but also the present. But the other photographer that I'd shared with you, Zanele Muholi, is someone who works specifically using portrait photography. And in that series that I'd shown you, Samnyama Ngonyama, which is one of their most prominent series, they do a technique which they heighten the contrast of their images in a way to bring up the black skin, the black pigmentation of their skin as a way of celebrating their heritage. And they even incorporate things you'll see like tires or pegs or, even domestic implements into making this striking, bold image as a way of either bringing light to historical events or others like more personal, gentle, intimate moments. There's a work called Besta in which they have an image with pegs, and that's meant to celebrate their mother, who was a domestic worker for many years. And so when they make an image that has a crown of pegs, it's to celebrate those people, it's to celebrate that worker that's often unseen, or people who do labor behind the scenes of washing and caretaking that don't get to be in the spotlight in museums.
Wow, wonderful. So it's paying tribute to everyday life and giving them the respect they deserve. It's like
Exactly.
making a lot of things visible to the world.
Exactly. Exactly.
And you're going to share with us some paintings that you like and their artists.
Yeah. I mean, one painter that I think might be actually quite interesting for the audience is someone like Simphiwe Nzube. So an artist like this, I've spoken about artists who look at, some of the more serious aspects of life, but someone like Simphiwe Nzube makes quite colorful, big paintings with like surreal figures with tentacles and crawling out of things. And it's meant to be magical realism as a way to look at, sometimes the bizarreness of life, but also just to play with color and like enjoy, the sensation of being, the sensation of looking at brightly colored objects. So that also falls within the spectrum of African contemporary art. But others like Portia Javahera, who is a Zimbabwean-born painter, for example, is someone who looks at the mythology of dreams. In her community, she grew up telling her dreams to her grandmother, who would then interpret them. And even like in that part of Zimbabwe as well, or like even in a lot of African indigenous communities, dreams are meant to be messages from ancestral guides, helping guide the communities, helping warn of danger. And so that practice is something that she's allowed to inform her contemporary art practice as a way of, celebrating where she's from, but also making these beautiful, ephemeral, mysterious objects accessible to the world, and make it okay to dream, and make it okay for things to not make the conventional linear sense, but allow reality to be multifaceted.
Wow, that's very deep. The multifaceted reality, which is really where we are now.
Yeah.
The reality we live in is multifaceted.
Yeah.
And the African artist's contemporary art capturing that is just amazing.
Yeah. But also, I mean, like I shared with you as well, there's some artists like El Anatsui and Serge Atukwe Clotti who look at environmental concerns, who use unconventional materials such as bottle caps and textiles, and found bits of aluminium from cans found in junkyards, or to even big gallon jugs made out of plastic that are often found in communities where, say, there isn't running water, and that yellow bucket is, so symbolic and so everyday of just, the simple human need to hydrate. And they use these materials in unconventional ways to speak of, environmental crises, the change in climate, the struggle sometimes to have running water, and what that means, in certain economies and certain parts of the world where there's so much waste that's dumped on by other regions, or to discuss the fact of life, that, you walk around the streets now and you'll see litter. And where does that come from? What do we do with it? Can we appreciate, where it comes from? Do we really look at what we discard as human beings on a day-to-day basis? And so some artists, work from, the ephemera of dreams, but others are also very grounded in the current everyday, the soil, environmental matters, things that are changing our world in real time.
Wow, so the artists are working as a mirror to help us reflect on the realities where we are now. Would you like to share with us some of the artworks you like from across the continent? And we'll have a taste of the diversity of the art offerings from Africa.
Yeah, so an artist that I really admire the work of is a Sudanese artist, painter called Kamala Ishaq. So she worked, in a period not far from, modernist Sudan's attempts to forge a national aesthetic, post-independence struggles, when, certain key art schools were being founded and people were really trying to reconcile the cultural nitty-gritty between Africa and the West. But what they chose to break away from as the Chrysalis group was using aesthetics as a form of expression, particularly with the sort of feminist angle of looking at women's struggles. You'll see a lot of female figures in her work as a way of also celebrating, female autonomy, or even like women's right to be in environments that can be quite male dominated. So that's, the work of Kamala Ishaq. On the other side is a Cameroonian artist called Barthélemy Togio. And, unlike Ishaq, who's someone who uses aesthetics as a way to celebrate the right to be necessarily, he's more of an issue sort of worker. He looks at, things from climate change to AIDS to migration to, even white supremacy, using things like watercolor, makes massive ceramic objects that are painted in his distinctive, almost watercolor style. So the aesthetic is quite happy, but in a way that's a little bit foreboding, a little bit ominous, but still somehow gentle. He considers himself a citizen of the world because his work is about all these hot topics that, absorb all of us in some degree or another as citizens of this planet. And then on the other side of the continent as well, in Ghana, there's this artist who works in sculpture and to some degree two-dimensional works called Ibrahim Mahama. And what he does is he works in textiles. He uses the kinds of sacks, the fabric that was used in a lot during the slave trade or during various kinds of, colonial endeavor, whether it was trading objects, but used as the ways of carrying things that were perceived to be of value. And what he'll do is make large-scale installations in which he covers entire buildings with this material as a way to, one, transform something into something that is obtainable with the sack, whether it's major institutions, as a comment on expansion, on the presumption of ownership, by actually making something that he's bagged himself, or to also make comments on just the history of how things are tied into, the migration, to the bloody roots of migration that were established at that point in time. And then there's also the very talented Wangechi Mutu, Kenyan-based artist, Kenyan-born artist. I think she lives in Nairobi now as well, who makes works that are also somewhat surreal, somewhat bizarre looking, for lack of a better word. But what they do to you is also, comment on the contemporary society's issues, whether they be, the commercialization of bodies, whether they be, the interacting factors that make the present. Some of the things look like fauna and flora, but that's also not just a commentary on land itself in terms of as it exists now with things like agriculture, but it's also to comment on, the history of land ownership, conquests, and imperial expansion.
Wonderful. You might think you're just sharing a few work that you like, but you are opening the eyes of the Chinese audience to an entire new field, the different continents and how we appreciate art. Thank you so much. 今天我们非常荣幸跟 Sinazo 能够有这么深入的交流，来了解来自非洲的当代艺术。我们希望下次我们还有深入的交流。 希望等一下我们的圆周论坛也会有非常丰盛的讨论。谢谢大家。Thank you so much, Sinazo.
Thank you for this conversation.
Thank you.